The diner buzzed with quiet activity as the morning rush subsided. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of bacon, lingering in the air like a comforting embrace. Grace sat at her usual booth by the window, the sunlight casting soft rays across her neatly styled silver hair. She sipped her tea in silence, her tailored coat draped across the seat beside her. To anyone watching, she might have seemed perfectly content. But Grace's eyes, sharp and observant, carried a shadow of loneliness that belied her poised exterior. At the counter, Simon moved briskly between orders, his energy a stark contrast to his weary eyes. He wore a faded apron over his sweatshirt, his dark hair slightly mussed from the morning's chaos. Despite the fatigue etched into his features, he greeted each customer with a warm smile, his politeness unwavering. Grace had been coming to the diner for months now, drawn not by the food, but by the rhythm of life it offered. A rhythm she desperately missed. It was here she first noticed Simon. She watched how he juggled trays and coffee pots, always quick to help an elderly customer with their walker or to calm a crying child. There was a kindness in him that stirred something within her, something she hadn't felt in years. On this particular day, Grace couldn't help but notice how drained Simon appeared. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his steps seemed heavier. Yet when he approached her table to refill her tea, he smiled as if the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on his young shoulders. She thanked him, and he nodded, smiling despite his exhaustion. As he walked away, Grace's gaze lingered on him. There was something profoundly unfair about the hand life which had dealt him. A part-time job here, another one at a grocery store, and classes sandwiched in between, all while raising 5 younger siblings. She had overheard bits of his story from the chatter of the staff, an orphan shouldering responsibilities that would overwhelm most adults. It was later, as she sat at home in her vast and empty estate, that an idea began to take shape. It was absurd, even laughable, yet the thought persisted, lingering like the echo of a forgotten melody. She couldn't offer Simon a normal life, but perhaps she could provide him with stability, a home free from the burdens he faced. When she returned to the diner the next day, her resolve had solidified. After her meal, she asked Simon to join her for a moment. Confused but polite, he sat across from her, his posture guarded. What she proposed left him stunned. For a moment he simply stared, the words hanging between them like an invisible chasm. Grace's calm tone and steady gaze only deepened his disbelief. Marriage. To her? His initial response was quick and firm, though his voice cracked under the weight of his emotions. To him, it wasn't possible. In fact, it wasn't right. But as he walked away, Grace noticed something flicker in his eyes. A mix of fear, curiosity, and the faintest glimmer of hope. The proposal lingered in Grace's mind like an unanswered question, tugging at her curiosity and her heart. Simon's reaction had been swift and final, but she couldn't ignore the fleeting vulnerability she had seen in his eyes. It wasn't rejection, it was hesitation, perhaps even desperation. Grace had learned long ago to recognize what people didn't say aloud, and Simon's silence had spoken volumes. Sitting alone in her grand but hollow home, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Simon's story than what meets the eye. His polite smiles and warm demeanor were carefully constructed masks, hiding the true depth of his struggles. Driven by a mix of concern and intrigue, she made a discreet phone call the next morning. An old acquaintance who specialized in uncovering life's hidden truths answered the line. Days passed, and Grace continued her routine visits to the diner. She observed Simon from a distance, noting the increasing strain etched into his face. He moved with the same energy, but there was a heaviness in his steps, as if each one dragged the weight of his world behind him. She spoke to him sparingly, sensing his discomfort, but her thoughts remained fixed on the report she awaited. When the investigator finally returned with his findings, Grace felt a pang of sadness as she unfolded the pages. Simon's life was a mosaic of hardship and sacrifice. He had been orphaned at 16, thrust into a role no teenager should have to assume. His siblings, ranging from a toddler to teenagers, depended on him entirely. Grace learned about his long hours at the diner, followed by night shifts at a nearby grocery store. He had once been a promising student with dreams of becoming an engineer, but those dreams had been shelved to ensure his family's survival. The most alarming discovery, however, was the precariousness of their situation. Their landlord had issued an eviction notice, and Simon was behind on rent by months. To make matters worse, his youngest sibling, a fragile 6-year-old girl, had fallen ill recently, adding medical bills to their mounting debts. Grace read these details with a sinking heart, realizing that Simon's life was a fragile house of cards on the verge of collapse. The next time Grace visited the diner, Simon was visibly more exhausted. His uniform hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes were bloodshot. Still, he maintained his usual kindness, though there was an edge of desperation to his movements. Grace didn't bring up her proposal, nor did she press him for conversation. Instead, she left a note with the tip she left behind stating that, if he needed to talk, she was ready to listen. It was a week later when Simon showed up at Grace's doorstep. His shoulders were hunched, and his face betrayed a mix of shame and determination. He spoke with a voice trembling from exhaustion, and something deeper: resignation. He had thought long and hard, weighing pride against necessity, and had come to the reluctant conclusion that he had no other choice. Unbeknownst to Grace, Simon had made this decision with a plan in mind. While her proposal offered stability, he saw it as an opportunity, a chance to escape the endless grind of poverty. He would agree to her terms, play the role expected of him, and use her wealth to solve his family's problems. Then, when the time was right, he would disappear. As Grace welcomed Simon inside, her heart swelled with hope. She believed she was offering him salvation. But Simon's guarded expression hinted at something far more complex, a tangled web of desperation, deceit, and survival. Neither could foresee how their arrangement would reshape both their lives in ways they never anticipated. Simon's decision to accept Grace's proposal had not come easily, but desperation had left him no other choice. As he walked away from her grand estate that evening, the weight of his decision settled heavily on his shoulders. He had agreed to a marriage born not of love but of necessity, a calculated move to secure a future for his siblings. Yet, beneath his stoic resolve, doubts simmered. The whispers began almost immediately. Word of the unusual engagement spread quickly through the small town, where gossip was as common as the changing seasons. The diner, once a place of mundane chatter, became a hub for hushed conversations about Grace Kensington and her peculiar arrangement with a man nearly 50 years her junior. Simon, often the subject of these whispers, began hearing stories that unsettled him. The most persistent rumor concerned Grace's late husband and her children, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. The stories varied. Some claimed she had been involved in their deaths, while others suggested her wealth had been amassed through dubious means. The truth was buried beneath layers of speculation, but the accusations gnawed at Simon. One evening, while closing up at the diner, Simon overheard two co-workers discussing Grace in low voices. One described her as a black widow who ensnared those close to her, leaving only misfortune in her wake. Another mentioned the tragedy that had befallen her family, a fire that had claimed her husband and 2 young children. Simon tried to ignore their words, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Back at home, Simon found himself staring at the meager belongings that filled their cramped apartment. His siblings were asleep, their faces peaceful despite the chaos looming over their lives. His youngest sister, still pale from her recent illness, clutched a stuffed bear. Simon felt a pang of guilt. He had agreed to marry Grace for them, but was he walking into a trap? The day of the wedding arrived sooner than Simon had anticipated. It was a simple ceremony held in Grace's sprawling garden. The only attendees were her loyal staff and Simon's siblings, who seemed both awed and confused by the opulent surroundings. The air was heavy with an uneasy stillness, as if the world itself held its breath. Simon stood beside Grace, his discomfort evident in his stiff posture. She, on the other hand, radiated quiet composure, her eyes soft with something he couldn't quite name, hope, perhaps, or longing. When they exchanged vows, Simon's voice wavered, betraying the turmoil within. As the ceremony concluded, Simon glanced at his siblings, who clapped enthusiastically, oblivious to the complexity of the situation. Grace's staff smiled politely, their expressions carefully neutral. Simon felt like a stranger in his own life, caught between two worlds he couldn't fully grasp. That night, as he sat in his new room, a space far grander than anything he had ever known, Simon's doubts returned with a vengeance. The rumors about Grace echoed in his mind, growing louder in the silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Grace, meanwhile, sat alone in her study, nursing a glass of wine. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of purpose. Her intentions were genuine, but she was not naive. She had seen the hesitation in Simon's eyes, the questions he didn't dare ask. She wondered how long it would take for him to trust her, or if he ever would. Their union was a fragile truce built on necessity and mistrust, and though neither of them knew it, the whispers and secrets that surrounded them were only the beginning. The move to Grace's mansion was surreal, like stepping into a world they'd only seen in movies. Simon's siblings were wide-eyed with awe as they wandered through the sprawling estate, their laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged hallways. Ornate chandeliers cast a warm glow on the marble floors, and every room seemed larger and more luxurious than the entirety of their old apartment. Grace had arranged for each of them to have their own room, furnished with more care and thought than Simon had ever seen in their previous living conditions. While his siblings reveled in their new surroundings, Simon felt a growing unease. The grandeur of the mansion, instead of comforting him, felt oppressive. The vastness of the space only amplified the whispers of doubt in his mind. He often found himself pacing his room at night, staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens below, wondering if he had made a mistake. It wasn't long before Simon began to notice peculiarities about the house. Grace would often disappear into her late husband's study, locking the heavy wooden door behind her. She would spend hours there till night, and when she came out her expression was unreadable. Once, Simon thought he heard muffled voices coming from the room, though he dismissed it as his imagination. The study itself seemed frozen in time, untouched by the years, and Simon couldn't shake the feeling that it held secrets Grace wasn't willing to share. Despite his unease, Simon couldn't deny Grace's efforts to make their new life easier. She arranged for the younger children to attend better schools, personally driving them on their first day to ensure they felt comfortable. She also hired tutors to help them catch up on subjects they struggled with, and for Simon's youngest sibling, she called in a specialist to treat her lingering illness. Grace's care wasn't limited to the practical. She spent hours with the children, reading bedtime stories, playing board games, and even helping with school projects. The maternal side she revealed was unexpected, and it left Simon conflicted. He couldn't reconcile this woman, the one his siblings adored, with the whispers of danger that haunted his thoughts. Simon tried to distance himself emotionally, reminding himself of his plan. But the warmth in Grace's interactions with his siblings began to chip away at his resolve. One evening, he walked into the kitchen to find her teaching his youngest sister how to bake cookies. The girl's laughter filled the room, and Grace's usually reserved face lit up with genuine joy. Watching the scene unfold, Simon felt a pang of guilt. His motives, once so clear, now seemed murky. Grace wasn't the cold, calculating figure he had imagined. She was a woman who had given his family a life they could never have dreamed of, asking little in return. But the doubts didn't vanish entirely. As much as Simon wanted to believe in Grace's kindness, the locked study and the lingering rumors kept him on edge. He resolved to tread carefully, knowing that trust was a fragile thing, both to build and to break. Simon's unease reached a tipping point one quiet evening. The mansion, bathed in soft golden light, felt more like a cage than a sanctuary as he paced outside Grace's study. The locked door and its secrets weighed heavily on his mind. The rumors still lingered, clawing at his conscience. It was time to confront her. When Grace emerged from the study, Simon was waiting, his expression conflicted but determined. His words spilled out faster than he had planned, revealing everything: the whispers, the doubts, the unsettling stories about her past. He expected anger or indignation, but instead, Grace's face crumpled. For a moment, she looked more vulnerable than Simon had ever seen her. She led him to the sitting room, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. Then, In a voice heavy with emotion, she began to speak. She shared the story of her family's tragic demise, a pain she had carried silently for decades. Her husband and children had succumbed to a rare genetic disorder, one that struck without warning and left her utterly alone. The fire that claimed their home was not an act of malice, but a devastating accident that occurred as she struggled to cope with her grief. Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she explained how the rumors began. People needed a villain, and her wealth made her an easy target. Over time, she had stopped trying to defend herself, retreating into solitude instead. Simon listened, guilt gnawing at him. He saw the weight of her pain and realized how wrong he had been to doubt her. This woman, who had opened her heart and home to him and his siblings, had endured unimaginable loss. In the days that followed, Simon found himself reevaluating everything. Grace's kindness was genuine, her intentions pure. He wanted to prove that he wasn't the opportunist she feared he might be. Unbeknownst to Simon, Grace had her own doubts. She needed to be sure of his character, so she devised a subtle test. One evening, she left her jewelry box, a collection of priceless heirlooms, open on the dining room table. She pretended to be busy elsewhere, but from a distance, she watched. Simon entered the room, his eyes catching the glint of the jewels under the chandelier. He paused, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Grace held her breath, but instead of pocketing anything, Simon closed the box carefully and left the room. Grace felt a wave of relief and something else. Hope. Simon, unaware he was being watched, felt a strange sense of peace. He had faced temptation and walked away, proving to himself that he could rise above his struggles. His redemption had begun, and though he didn't realize it yet, his relationship with Grace had taken a pivotal turn. The town's annual spring festival was a lively affair, filled with laughter, music, and chatter. Grace, ever reclusive, had avoided such events for years, but Simon convinced her to attend. He thought it might be a good distraction for her, and a chance to face the community that had judged her so harshly. As they wandered through the festival, Simon overheard a group of locals talking about Grace. Their words were cutting, mocking her wealth, her eccentricity, and the whispers of her supposed dark past. Simon's blood boiled. He had been one of those doubters once, but now he knew better. Without thinking, he stepped forward and addressed the group. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke of Grace's generosity and the sacrifices she had made for his family. He shared how she had transformed their lives, providing not just material comforts but also love and stability. He told them about her late husband and children, emphasizing her resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. The crowd grew silent, and some even looked ashamed. Grace, standing at a distance, overheard Simon's words. Her eyes welled with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Later that evening, as they returned home, Grace thanked Simon. She admitted that his defense had touched her deeply. Simon, emboldened by the day's events, proposed an idea. What if they started a charity in her family's name? It could help others in need while honoring the memory of those she had lost. Grace was hesitant at first, unsure if she could face such a public endeavor. But Simon's enthusiasm was infectious, and she eventually agreed. Together they began laying the groundwork for the charity, finding a renewed sense of purpose in their shared mission. The whispers in town began to fade, replaced by admiration for Grace's strength and Simon's loyalty. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, became a beacon of hope for the community. And though their journey was far from over, both Simon and Grace found solace in the knowledge that they were no longer alone. The mansion, which once stood as a monument to Grace's isolation, now buzzed with activity. Papers cluttered the dining table, phone calls filled the air, and visitors came and went with ideas and suggestions. The foundation was no longer just an idea, it was coming to life. The charity, named the Kensington's Heart Foundation, in honor of her late husband, Mr. Chris Kensington, and children, aimed to provide scholarships, housing, and health care to underprivileged families. Its mission resonated with Simon's own struggles, and he threw himself into the work with an energy Grace found both admirable and infectious. The first event was modest but heartfelt. It was held in the mansion's gardens, with attendees ranging from local business owners to families who had once whispered rumors about Grace. Simon, standing beside her, introduced the foundation with a voice full of conviction, speaking about the importance of giving others the opportunities they hadn't had. As Grace addressed the crowd, she surprised everyone by sharing a deeply personal story. She spoke about the loneliness that had consumed her after the loss of her family, the long nights spent wondering if she could have done more, and the years she spent hiding behind the mansion's gates. Her voice trembled but didn't falter, and her vulnerability moved the crowd. The whispers in town took on a new tone. Grace was no longer the mysterious widow shrouded in suspicion. She was a woman who had suffered deeply, but was now using her pain to create something beautiful. The respect she earned was tangible, and it reflected in the community's growing support for the foundation. The foundation's work quickly gained traction. A young boy whose family had been living out of their car received housing through the initiative. A teenage girl with dreams of becoming a doctor secured her first scholarship. Stories of hope and gratitude began to replace the skepticism that had once surrounded Grace's name. Yet amidst the progress, the mansion held on to its shadows. Late at night, Simon often found Grace sitting alone by the fire, her gaze fixed on a photo of her late husband and children. She was proud of what they had accomplished, but still haunted by what she had lost. One night Simon joined her in the quiet. They didn't speak, but the shared silence said enough. Grace felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years, and Simon felt his guilt dissolve into something new: empathy. The days in the mansion began to feel less like an arrangement and more like a family. Simon and Grace found themselves drawn into long, meaningful conversations. They spoke of their pasts, their fears, and their dreams. Grace's wisdom and quiet strength began to remind Simon of the mother he had lost too soon. And for Grace, Simon's resilience and determination reignited a sense of purpose she thought she'd never feel again. Simon's siblings, meanwhile, embraced their new life with open arms. Grace became a grandmother figure to them, showering them with love and attention. She taught Simon's youngest sister how to knit, helped his middle brother prepare for a spelling bee, and listened patiently to the teenage angst of his eldest sister. Their laughter often echoed through the mansion, a sound that Grace hadn't heard in years. But the peace was soon disrupted. One afternoon, an envelope arrived at the mansion, addressed to Grace. Inside was a detailed letter from a former staff member, accusing Simon of manipulation. The writer claimed that Simon had confessed his plan to exploit Grace's wealth and disappear once he had secured enough for his family. The accusations shook Grace. She retreated into her study, wrestling with the old doubts she thought she had put to rest. Simon, sensing her distance, pressed her until she reluctantly shared the letter. His face paled as he read the words, each one feeling like a dagger. Simon knew the letter was a fabrication, but the damage was done. The trust he had painstakingly built with Grace now hung by a thread. Fueled by equal parts anger and determination, he decided to confront the accuser directly. He tracked down the former staff member, a man named Walter, who had worked for Grace years ago. Walter, bitter over a perceived slight from his time at the mansion, had seen an opportunity to tarnish Grace's newfound happiness. He admitted his lies under the weight of Simon's fury, but the confrontation left Simon deeply shaken. The idea that someone would exploit Grace's vulnerability was too close to his own past intentions, and it forced him to reckon with the person he had once been. When Simon returned to the mansion, he handed Grace a recording of Walter's confession. Grace listened silently, her eyes unreadable. After a long pause, she looked at Simon and responded, stating that his actions to track Walter was all she needed to clear her doubts. Grace's forgiveness was immediate, but Simon still felt the weight of his past intentions. He poured his guilt into his work with the foundation, driven by a need to prove his loyalty. Slowly, their bond began to heal. Their relationship grew stronger in the wake of the betrayal, built now on a foundation of mutual trust. Simon no longer saw Grace as just a benefactor or a means to an end. She had become a mentor, a friend, and in many ways the family he had lost. And Grace, in turn, saw Simon as the son she had always wished for. Together, they found a strength that no letter or rumor could ever break. Despite fixing their relationship, it wasn't long before their happy relationship was disrupted. It started with a slight weakness in Grace's arm and a slur in her speech, subtle enough that she tried to brush it off. But when she collapsed in the middle of a meeting with the foundation's board, panic spread through the mansion like wildfire. Simon was at her side before the staff could call for help, his heart pounding as he carried her to the car and rushed her to the hospital. The doctors confirmed it was a minor stroke, a warning of the toll her years of stress and grief had taken. Grace was advised to rest and avoid strenuous activities. Simon, shaken to his core, took it upon himself to ensure she followed the doctor's orders. He canceled meetings, arranged for round-the-clock care, and even took over her responsibilities at the foundation. In the quiet of her recovery room, Grace observed Simon's unwavering dedication. He brought her favorite books, made her laugh with stories from the mansion, and kept her updated on the foundation's progress. Yet she wanted to test the depth of his loyalty one last time. One afternoon, Grace casually mentioned that she was updating her will, leaving everything to the foundation. She watched Simon closely, searching for any sign of resentment or self-interest. But Simon's reaction was immediate and genuine. He fully supported her decision, expressing relief that her legacy would continue helping others. That night, Grace sat in her bed, tears welling in her eyes. Simon's transformation was undeniable. He was no longer the desperate young man she had met, but a selfless and compassionate person who had found purpose in helping others. Their bond deepened even further, built now on a foundation of mutual trust and unwavering respect. Grace began to see Simon not just as the son she had wished for, but as someone who could carry forward her vision long after she was gone. The foundation's impact grew beyond anything Grace or Simon had imagined. Simon, once reluctant to be in the spotlight, became the face of the foundation. He spoke passionately at events, drawing from his and Grace's shared journey to inspire donors and volunteers. Grace, now hailed as a philanthropist, basked in the positive attention. The whispers and rumors that had once plagued her were replaced with admiration and gratitude. She often smiled quietly, knowing her past hardships had paved the way for a brighter future for so many. But even as the foundation flourished, Grace's health declined. One peaceful morning, she passed away in her sleep. Simon found a letter she had left for him on her desk. In it, she expressed her gratitude for his companionship and acknowledged his growth. She revealed that she had left her wealth to the foundation and Simon's siblings, ensuring her vision would live on. At her memorial, Simon stood before a sea of mourners, his voice steady yet emotional. He spoke of Grace's kindness, her struggles, and her unwavering belief in second chances. He urged everyone to withhold judgment and extend compassion, sharing how Grace had transformed his life. With Grace's legacy in his hands, Simon continued the work they had started. The foundation became a symbol of hope and redemption, teaching the world that even the most fractured lives could be rebuilt with love, forgiveness, and a shared purpose. Thank you for watching and for being part of this journey with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. We'll see you in the next video.